written for our instruction, that by steadfastness and by the encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. May the God of steadfastness and encouragement grant you to live in such harmony with one another, in accord with Christ Jesus, that together you may with one voice glorify the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Notice how he's speaking about bearing with the strong, bearing with the weak, how it's important to show love, to imitate Christ, to be patient, and this contributes to unity in the church. That's ultimately what he wants. Okay, so the subject matter then is here, the very beginning of Romans 15, is continuing. We have I don't know what to say. It's not misfortune, but we live in a time with the Bible when it has been divided up into chapters and verses, and that definitely affects how we read the text. So we have a tendency at the end of 14 to say, well, we're finished with chapter 14. Now we're starting chapter 15, which is how I started this program. But that causes us sometimes not to see the connections, the context. You see, what he's saying here is directly connected to what he told us in chapter 14. So this is just our reality. The Bible has chapters and verses now, but as much as is possible, try to see the connections between what came before and what you're reading now, because without that, you really don't understand it properly. So how did chapter 14 end? Do you remember? He talked about how we shouldn't pass judgment on one another, but decide not to put a stumbling block in front of a brother. How he is convinced, he's persuaded that there is nothing that is unclean, but something is unclean if a person thinks it is unclean. And he said that you can't be so obsessed with what you believe and what you're doing that you're not acting out of love. Okay, so he said, don't let your good be spoken of as evil. Remember that? And that the kingdom of God is not about food and drink, but about righteousness and peace and joy. And then he also said, do not for the sake of food destroy the work of God. Everything is clean, but it's wrong for someone to make another person fall just by what you eat. So he's speaking here again about being considerate of the sensibilities and religious sensitivities of other people. And he says, whatever faith you have, and I think he's speaking there about the eating of certain foods, keep that between yourself and God. But happy is the person, or blessed is the person who has no reason to judge himself. But if somebody has doubts and they eat anyhow, this is sin because they are eating without having faith. So then he says, we who are strong ought to bear with the failings of the weak. So that's at the very beginning of 15. So notice there at the beginning of chapter 15, St. Paul has put himself with the strong. Not that we're surprised. We wouldn't expect him to place himself with the weak. But this is the same discussion he had at the beginning of chapter 14, talking about the strong and the weak. He said at the beginning of chapter 14 that as for the man who is weak in faith, welcome him. Remember that? That's chapter 14, verse 1, but not for disputes over matters of food, over opinions. Remember? So welcome everybody. Even if they don't share your opinion on certain matters, welcome them. And he called some people strong and some people weak. Now we see that he is, of course, identifying himself with the strong. So what is his point? What are the strong supposed to do? He's appealing here to the strong. He's not asking the weak to conform to share his opinion about here having to do with matters of food. He's not saying, hey, you weak people, you better get strong and listen to what I'm telling you. He's already told them that he doesn't think the law of Moses needs to be followed anymore. He says, I am convinced that there is no such thing as anything unclean because of the Lord Jesus Christ, who eliminated all these things, the regulations of the law of Moses. But he realized from a pastoral perspective that some people had difficulty with this, and he didn't scold them over it. He appealed not to the people who have the problem with it, but to the people who don't have the problem with it. Can you see the wisdom there? That's not how most of us would handle it. Don't you agree? Most of us, if we are among the strong, like St. Paul, we would be lecturing the weak people, right? And telling them that what they believe and what they're doing is wrong. So he doesn't take that approach at all. He's asking the strong to accommodate the weak. So he's not saying that the strong are supposed to force the weak to do as they say, not that they're supposed to outnumber them, outvote them, make the weak listen to them, talk to the weak until they agree with them. No, what he is saying is that the strong should yield to the weak in these matters, that the strong should be flexible, that the strong are the ones who should bend. We shouldn't expect the people with certain sensitivities to bend. It's the strong, it's the people who know that these things ultimately don't matter, should be the ones to be yielding. Now, I think that this is amazing, and this is why St. Paul is a saint, because before you accuse anyone of saying that we should never compromise anything in Orthodoxy, just think about what St. Paul has said here. Now, be careful. I am not saying that we are to compromise or bend or yield to others on matters of dogma or morality. We never compromise that. He's not talking about that here. Here he's talking about customs and lifestyle. He's talking about food, but we could apply that to any number of things that we do in Orthodoxy that people squabble over. What about the toll houses, for goodness sake? Why are we arguing over that? Why is anyone arguing over that? Why don't you take St. Paul's words to heart there? And you know what? Rather than that, people are actually saying that if you believe that, you're not Orthodox, or if you don't believe that, you're not Orthodox. We know that St. Paul was bald, but if he had hair, he would be tearing it out over this. These are not the kind of things that we should be arguing over. We should be arguing, frankly, over anything. But can you see his wisdom here? To be recognizing what is important that we hold on to and what other things we should yield to. People have differences of opinion, and we're not supposed to argue over these things. Now, unfortunately, what we have today in Orthodoxy, because everybody imagines himself a theologian, and I'm sorry to say, that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book Thinking Orthodox, was because so many people are becoming embroiled in these discussions and these disputes and these debates, and everybody thinks he's right or she's right. Everybody's involved in these discussions, and they are doing it very pridefully because they've appointed themselves as the modern day St. Mark of Ephesus. I'm Orthodox and I'm not going to yield on anything, and everybody thinks that they're imitating St. Mark of Ephesus. Well, you know what? They're not. Because St. Mark of Ephesus took a stand on matters of absolute importance in the church, doctrinal matters, dogmatic matters. You see what I'm trying to say? He wasn't there arguing about head coverings or toll houses or things that didn't have a real doctrinal importance in the church. He was talking about the infallibility of the Pope or the complete supremacy of the Pope or the whole church. He was talking about other things like purgatory and things like the filioque that the Latins were trying to force the Orthodox to accept. So don't put yourself in the category of St. Mark. Don't imagine if you have, because you're trying to imitate him, you really should confess that. Excuse me for telling you that, but you're coming from a position of pride. He was saving the church. What you're doing about arguing over vaccines or prophecies or toll houses or all of these other little tiny things is absolutely useless, and it's actually harmful in the church. It's harmful because you're turning people off. And most of you aren't qualified to talk about these things because you think you know, but you really don't know. And actually, St. Paul said that too. He happened to say that in 1 Corinthians. What did he mean when he said, you know, but you really don't know? He meant that you have intellectual knowledge, but you don't know the mind of God. And you certainly don't know the mind and heart of the person that you're debating with. So I'm trying to encourage you, my dear beloved brothers and sisters in Christ, to be very careful, to avoid these kinds of disputes and arguments, and don't even read about them on the internet. Don't get involved in these things because it's not helpful to you. It's harmful to you. And anybody who thinks that they must hold on with rigidity to every little thing that they believe is appropriate in orthodoxy for an Orthodox Christian to do is not imitating St. Mark of Ephesus or any other saint, because orthodoxy is not about rules. It's not about rigidity. What St. Paul is telling us here is what is most important is how we behave toward each other in the church on these little issues of discipline and lifestyle that are not essential to the faith. All of these things that tend to be discussed and focused and argued about on the internet among the Orthodox are not essential to the faith because, thank God, most of us agree with each other on the things that are essential to the faith. I don't see Orthodox Christians disagreeing on the really big things. Maybe that's why we're arguing about the little things. But please try to stop doing that and encourage other people to stop doing this, okay? Because, as I said, it's a distraction and it's harmful. So I had mentioned, about the mark of the beast. That has to be something that we receive willingly. And somebody wrote to tell me, if somebody tried to force me to kill somebody, I would prefer to die myself. Of course. But St. Paul is talking here about putting the other person first. But that was not my analogy. So we have to be very careful with what we read and what we hear, not to misconstrue it. I've been misconstrued plenty of times. I should know, okay? Because my words are being misconstrued by people who are jumping to find something wrong with what I say, and they don't understand it. So you think you know something, but please trust me when I tell you, you don't know enough. And even if you know something, you don't know because you're lacking the Orthodox phronema, which is the phronema that St. Paul is trying to encourage us to have here. The disposition, the mind, the heart, the attitude we're supposed to have is what St. Paul is emphasizing here. Not whether you're right or wrong, because St. Paul agrees with the strong. Are you following what he's saying here? He is with the strong. He agrees with them, but he's asking them to yield to the weak, to pay attention to the sensitivities of the people who don't agree with them, and not to force the issue. That's the attitude we should have. But too often, what we see are people getting on their high horse, imagining themselves as St. Mark of Ephesus or St. Athanasius, and they're going to save the church because they're on a crusade to insist that we must observe absolutely everything with precision. And that kind of rigidity is exactly what St. Paul is speaking against here. Can you see that? Just trying to tell you. Okay. So we have to act in the interests of the other person, not of ourselves. We have to always act in the interest of the other person, not spend our time and effort trying to prove to them that we are right. Eventually, they may come around. If you really are right, they may come around to understanding what you're saying. But we have to try to bring them toward understanding through kindness, through gentleness, through love, through patience. This is what St. Paul is saying. So he doesn't imagine if St. Paul had said, just keep arguing with the weak until they believe you, until they listen to you, until they hold your opinion. So everything is a matter of our consideration of the other person and about following, when we're talking about freedom, talking about following our conscience in consideration of the other, not conscience in terms of freedom of opinion. That's not what we're talking about here at all. So we become very fixated on being right, on asserting ourselves. And when we do that, we're missing the big picture, which is love of others, which is more important than being technically correct. Okay? So that's what God is going to judge us for. God is not going to judge us for whether or not we were right in the argument, but whether or not we were acting out of love and consideration. And who is our example? Christ, because that's what St. Paul raises here as the example. For Christ did not please himself. So let's take a look at this again. The first 3 verses of chapter 15. We who are strong ought to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, to edify him. For Christ did not please himself. He's our model. He's our example. So if you're just trying to spend your time trying to convince other people that they're right, that you're right and they're wrong, then you're violating this principle, and you're certainly not acting like Christ. So I really doubt that you're going to win anybody over to Christ. And if they do and they start imitating you, that's going to be a big problem for them, because that's not the kind of attitude or spirit we're supposed to have. So Christ is our example. He did not please himself. Why? He did not have to be incarnate. He did not have to tolerate abuse. He didn't have to die on the cross. All of these things were things he did not have to do, but he did them out of love for us. And that's how we are supposed to behave toward others. So whether we are right or not right, that is not the issue. This fixation on proving something and arguing these points from a very, I don't want to say rationalistic perspective, but it kind of really is a symptom of our times and of our culture, which is very much based on the emphasizing the intellect. Orthodoxy is not about that. Orthodoxy emphasizes the heart, not the intellect. So to the extent that you feel compelled to exert proof and emphasize your own intellect, your knowledge, how you are correct, and without real concern for the spiritual situation of another person, then you're not acting in an Orthodox spirit. You don't have Orthodox phronema. So let's be sure we understand what Paul is saying when he says, I'll read it again, lest you misunderstand it. Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, to edify him. Now notice, he did not say, let each of us please his neighbor. Only that we should please the neighbor in the things that are good for him, to edify him. So here again, I'm not saying we should accept everything another person does. He doesn't say just please other people. Paul did not agree with that either. So can you see that there is a middle way here? We are neither supposed to insist on the correctness of our position, nor are we supposed to allow everything and say, that's okay. We're supposed to please you. There's a middle way. We're supposed to please our neighbor for his good, for his edification. So we should not accept everything because that shows love, because that does not show love, right? We should not accept heresy. We should not accept immorality. St. Paul is not saying that when he says, please your neighbor in what is good, because that's edifying for him. So for whatever is useful to the person, when we show love toward them, when we show patience toward them, that's helpful to them. It allows them to grow in the faith, to grow in knowledge, to sort of see things from a different perspective. That is the attitude we should have, but not simply to accept everything because that's loving, because St. Paul would say that's not loving. To accept sin or immorality or heresy, that's not loving. So I'm telling you this because someone wrote to tell me that I was advocating compromising the faith. And that's when the whole St. Mark of Ephesus thing came up. I'm compromising the faith, and St. Mark of Ephesus did not compromise the faith. Well, first of all, the middle way is something that the fathers talk about. It's from the Bible. And St. Gregory, the theologian, was most famous for that. And believe me, he wasn't compromising the faith. And I'm not advocating compromising the faith. And what St. Mark of Ephesus was fighting for was not about these little things, but talking about the big matters of faith, of dogma. Okay? The fathers are against extremes. So I'm never talking about compromising the faith. We're talking here about little things that people are squabbling over in parishes that people make into big things, like the head coverings, like the toll houses, like the spoon, etc. And you know how the attitude we should have toward these things has to be pastoral, and it has to be based on love. But that doesn't mean that we're compromising the faith. And the spoon is not the same as the Eucharist. So you know how I feel about this. I don't believe in using multiple spoons. But in a situation where it's demanded and the bishop has no other choice and he's made that decision, because without that decision, he has to literally close the churches. You can't argue with that. Can you see that that's the middle way? That's the middle way. But it's not a compromise of communion, and it's only temporary. So we have to know what is appropriate. We have to have discernment. And if you're just on a crusade or a campaign, then you have no discernment. And especially if you have no pastoral background, if you're not a priest, and certainly not if you're a bishop, because if you're not a bishop, because the bishops are charged with these things. It's remarkable to me how many people are so quick to be so critical of the bishops and the priests who are really struggling with these issues. And they're doing what they can, what they think is best. And they're the ones who are responsible for the decisions that they make. Don't you get involved, lest you want God to judge you for the decisions that you make. And it might not be a good thing. So this is the middle way. Listen to what St. Paul was saying. Christ did not please himself. So he's not saying that we should do everything simply to please others, but we should please our neighbor for his good, to edify him. So whatever we choose to do should always be in the best interests of the others, to edify them. Therefore, if we need to use multiple spoons to keep the church open, that's for the neighbor's good. If we're using multiple spoons because we want to suggest to people, or we believe that you can get sick from communion, that's not good. Can you see the difference there? So rather than being rigid and say we must always use multiple spoons, or we should never use multiple spoons, we have to have some pastoral sensitivity, some understanding of what is behind it, what is going to be edifying to the people. So it's not one or the other in every respect. We have to avoid rigidity. We have to avoid extremes. So we don't approve of immorality. We don't compromise the faith, because that's not in the interest of the other person. On the other hand, arguing with somebody over something that is rather trivial is also not in their best interest. Can you see that there's a middle way there? That's what St. Paul is talking about here. That's what we're supposed to imitate. Not engage in mindless, unnecessary disputes over issues that are actually not important. On the other hand, we're also not supposed to compromise the faith in matters of dogma or morality simply for the purpose of peace and harmony. We're not supposed to do that either. So all of these things require a great deal of discernment. Not everything that the church teaches and not everything that we do in church is equally important. I just want you to recognize that rigidity and stubbornness are not virtues, unless you're talking about dogma. That's different. We never compromise that. But on all these many other little things that we do, we have to recognize that there are times, sometimes because the church does this all the time, we have what we call economia with the canons of the church. The canons of the church are flexible. Sometimes they're broken out of economia, which means for pastoral reasons. We actually violate the canons of the church sometimes. So if you don't understand that, you have no business talking about theology. All right? Be careful, because the reason why I keep warning you, if you haven't read Thinking Orthodox, please read it. Read the last third where it talks about the danger of theologizing. You are creating serious problems for yourself. You're setting yourself up to be judged by God in the worst possible way. You think what you're doing is noble and good, but you might not be. So please be very, very careful. There is so much more that you have to be aware of before you start telling other people what to do and how to behave and what to believe. So be very careful about that. So we've reached the first half hour of our program. When we come back, we will listen to St. John Chrysostom. I'm sure you'll be happy to hear from him because I will read you his words and I'll stop giving you my own. And we will hear what Chrysostom says about this section of Romans. Okay, so join me after the break.
Dr. Constantinou will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
So here's a question for you. What does it mean to think Orthodox? What are the unspoken and unexplored premises and presumptions underlying what Christians believe? Orthodox Christianity is based on preserving the mind of the early church, its phronema. Dr. Jeannie Constantinou brings her more than 40 years' experience as a professor, Bible teacher, and speaker to bear in explaining what the Orthodox phronema is, how it can be acquired, and how that phronema is expressed in true Orthodox theology, as practiced by those who are properly qualified by both training and a deep relationship with Christ. Thinking Orthodox, now available at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
We are back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
Okay, so let's see what St. John Chrysostom has to say about this passage of Romans chapter 15. So first he quotes St. Paul. Let every one of us please his neighbor for his good, for edification. But what he says is this: are you powerful? Let the weak test your power. Isn't that interesting? If you're really so strong in your faith, test it on the weak, not by being stubborn, but show how strong you are by yielding to them. This is what he's saying. And I'm sorry, I interrupted St. John Chrysostom. Let's go back to what he says. Are you powerful? Let the weak test your power. Let him come to know your strength. Please him. And he does not only say please him for his good, and not only for his good, lest the advanced person should say, you see, I'm drawing him to his good. But he adds, to edification. And so if you are rich or powerful, do not please yourself, but the poor and the needy, because in that way you will at once have true glory to enjoy and be doing much service. For glory from things of the world soon flies away, but that which comes from things of the Spirit is abiding, if you do it for edification. For this reason, he requires this of all people. For it's not for this person or for that person who are to do it, but for each of you. Then, since it was a great thing, he had commanded them and has bidden them even to relax their own preferences in order to set aright the other's weakness. He again introduces Christ in the following words: for even Christ did not please himself. Did you catch what Chrysostom said there? He said that St. Paul encouraged the strong to relax their own perfection. So they were following everything correctly. He says, relax it so that you please not yourself, but the other person. That's amazing. And then he gives him again the example of Christ. So let's return to Chrysostom. But what is the meaning of he did not please himself? He had the power not to be reproached, the power not to suffer what he did suffer, and to mind after his own things. But he was not so minded, but even though looking to our good, he neglected his own. He's speaking about Christ, of course. Why did he not say he emptied himself? Quoting Philippians chapter 2. Because this was not the only thing that Paul wanted to point out, that Christ became man, but that he was also ill-treated and obtained a bad reputation with many, being looked upon as weak. So what about that? So are you afraid that if you're not severe, rigid, exacting, and following all these rules, that people will think that you're a bad Orthodox Christian? Christ didn't worry about that. Remember, Christ was criticized for what he did, but everything he did, like eating with tax collectors and sinners, he did this out of love so that he might draw them to himself. That's what he was doing. So let's always consider pleasing our neighbor, not ourselves. Chrysostom also talked about what it means to please your neighbor in a homily on Matthew's gospel, and I thought this was really useful. So there's so many points he makes here, so I wanted to share it with you. Nothing provokes so much God as for us to be inclined to overlook the things concerning our neighbor. Therefore, he also affirmed love to be the distinguishing mark of his disciples, since it is altogether necessary that he who loves should take thought for the things of his beloved. To this way, then, let us hold, for this is especially the way that leads up to heaven, which renders men followers of Christ, which makes them, as far as possible, like God. Have you ever thought about what makes us like God? Is it following little rules and insisting upon them? Does that make us godlike? If we do not take into consideration how other people are reacting to this, how are they reacting to our behavior, to our attitude, then nothing is more important than showing love to the other person if it's going to be edifying. So if necessary to relax the strictness, Chrysostom says, then we do that. Now, again, he's not talking about compromising on matters of dogma or morality. We're not supposed to please people into sin. But he's talking about here being patient with others who aren't at our level. That's really what he's talking about, because St. Paul identifies himself as one of the strong and others as the weak. So not everybody is at your level. You're not supposed to browbeat them into coming up to your level, or insist that they do what you do, or think what you think, or behave as you behave. So this is back to Chrysostom. At any rate, see how these virtues are more needful, which have their dwelling by this way, and if you will, let us make an inquiry into them. Let us bring forth the sentences from the judgment of God. There are two ways of a holy life. Let the one secure the goodness of him that practices it, but the other of his neighbor also. So pay attention to what he's saying here. There's two ways to achieve a holy life. One in which the holiness is for you only, and the other in which your holiness also, or your pursuit of holiness, benefits somebody else. So listen to what Chrysostom says here. Surely, let us see which is the more approved, which leads us to the summit of virtue. Surely he who seeks his own things only will receive even from Paul endless blame. And when I say from Paul, I mean from Christ, because the other will receive commendations and crowns. Where is this evident? Hear what his language is to one and what he says to the other. Let no man seek his own, but every man seek another's wealth. Do you see? He rejects the one and brings in the other. And again, let every one of you please his neighbor for good, for edification. Then comes also the praise beyond words with an admonition. Praise beyond words, for Christ did not please himself. Even these judgments then are sufficient to show victory. But that this may be done even superabundantly, let us see among good works, which are confined to ourselves, which pass over from us and to others also. Fasting, then, lying bare ground, keeping virginity, and a self-denying life, these things bring their advantage to the persons themselves who do them. But those that pass from ourselves to our neighbor are almsgiving, teaching, and love. Hear then also St. Paul in this matter, who said, though I bestow all of my goods to feed the poor, and even give my body to be burnt, if I have not love, I am nothing. Remember that? So love is the critical thing. This is what St. John Chrysostom is reminding us of here. So now he's going to give us yet another point. Chrysostom, but if you are willing, from a third point, let us also compare them. Let the one fast and deny himself and be a martyr and be burnt to death, but let another delay his martyrdom for his neighbor's edification, and let him not only delay it, but even depart without martyrdom. Who will be more approved after his removal from here? Did you ever think about that? Because we admire the martyrs so much, but a person who basically martyrs themselves by being loving toward another person, by thinking of the other person first but ahead of themselves, even so much as to deny themselves martyrdom or delay their martyrdom, that person is more worthy of commendation from God. That's what Chrysostom is saying. He's convinced of that, and I think he's right. And here is the example that he gives. For we have St. Paul, the blessed Paul is at hand, giving his judgment, saying, to depart and be with Christ is better. Nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you. He preferred his neighbor's edification to being with Christ. For this is in the highest sense to be with Christ, even to be doing his will. For nothing is so much as his will as it is to do that which is for a neighbor's good. Now, the next example that he gives is quite interesting. Would you have me give you yet a fourth proof of these things? And now this example, which I find very interesting that he gives, is from the end of St. John's Gospel, the famous scene between St. Peter and the Lord, which Catholics so often point to as proof that Peter was called to be the first pope. Okay, so let's listen to how Chrysostom interprets it. I've shown you before elsewhere how Chrysostom, and no early interpreters, including on the Latin side, ever thought that by either Matthew 16 or here John chapter 21, that the Lord was giving Peter authority over the whole church by his words. But this is kind of interesting how Chrysostom understands this. And by the way, his understanding of this is consistent also with what other fathers said. Would you have me give you a fourth proof also of these things? Peter, do you love me? He said. Feed my sheep. And having asked him a third time, declared this to be an infallible proof of love. But not to priests only is this said, but to every one of us also who are entrusted with a little flock. Isn't that beautiful? This was not a message only for St. Peter, certainly was nothing about making him the Pope. And it's been routinely interpreted to refer to anybody who has pastoral authority. But Chrysostom is taking it far beyond that and saying that this is the mark of love. This is what Christ wants from us, that we show love by feeding his sheep. So Chrysostom is taking this far beyond. He says not just bishops and priests, but to anyone who has a little flock. And guess what? That's everyone. So listen to what he says here. It's so beautiful. But not only to priests is this said, but to every one of us also who are entrusted with a little flock. For do not despise it, because it is a little flock. Each of us has a sheep, Let him lead that sheep to the proper pastures, and let the man, as soon as he has risen from his bed, seek after nothing else but how he may do and say something whereby he may render his whole house more reverent. The woman again, the wife, in other words, let her be indeed a good housekeeper, but before attending to this, let her have another more needful care, that the whole household may work the works of heaven. For if in worldly matters, before attending to the affairs of our household, we labor diligently to pay public dues, that we may not be negligent in those matters, be beaten and dragged to the marketplace, and suffer 10,000 unseemly things, much more ought we do this in spiritual things, and render what is due to God, the King of all, first, that we may not come to that place where there is gnashing of teeth. And after these virtues, let us seek, which together with our own salvation will be in the greatest degree to profit our neighbor. This is why he is the golden mouth, my dear brothers and sisters. And it's not just the eloquence in which he says these things, but it is the insight, the divine Holy Spirit working within the mind of St. John Chrysostom to bring out this amazing insight. Each of us has a little flock, and whether it's, even if you live alone, you have a little flock. There are people around you that you're responsible for. And why does he, with Peter, use this image of the shepherd and the flock? Feed my sheep. Because we don't beat the sheep. We have to lead them gently. And so this is what requires a very gentle hand, and always to be thinking of others. So I thought it was beautiful, especially those of you who are, moms and you're home with kids and husbands, or you wake up in the morning and you're taking yourself to work, but never forgetting that the most important thing is making your household a place of reverence, but not by being rigid and difficult and surly and, critical, but sweetness and gentleness and with love, and sometimes yielding where that is appropriate. You see? So what beautiful insights we have by St. John Chrysostom. Who can not love him? I love him so much. And that's why I think it's so important. What a beautiful insight. Everybody has a little flock. Will you remember that? You have a flock around you. We're responsible. And it's easy, too easy, I think, for us to treat the people closest to us the worst, right? We sometimes lose our temper with others. We're short with them because they love us, and we're, sometimes we're we're not careful with what we say sometimes to the people we love, the way we are with people who are, more removed from us, or their work associates or something like this. So we have to, on the contrary, show that kind of love and concern. Our neighbor is even the people in our house. So I thought that was just beautiful. I hope you enjoyed that. We have a listener email sort of along these same lines. Well, actually, it is along these same lines. It was prompted by last week's lesson. And this comes to us from Patrick in Fort Fairfield, Maine, up there in the corner of the country near Quebec. Maine's beautiful. Dear Presbytera Dr. Jeannie, I had a question for you regarding the freedom Paul talks about in Romans 14 and not being a stumbling block to others. I grew up Protestant until my wife and I converted to Orthodoxy a couple years ago. My father grew up Catholic and left the Roman Catholic Church to become Protestant, and largely rejects anything that looks remotely Catholic. The majority of my family is still Protestant, and so when I do anything that is a common practice for Orthodox Christians, such as crossing myself or prostrations, I don't want to be a stumbling block to them due to their rejection of these practices. However, we, Orthodox, know they are correct. How do we reconcile these practices with Romans, with what St. Paul was saying here in Romans? Should we not do them around the family, or should we maintain the practices that are given to us for our spiritual benefit? Patrick from Fort Fairfield, Maine. Well, that's such a wonderful question, Patrick, and so appropriate. And notice how we are faced with these real world situations. And thanks for reminding us that so many of us are faced with these situations. Almost all of my family, I think everybody in my family is Orthodox. So I don't have to face this kind of a situation, but so many of you out there do, and you're navigating the family dynamic, aren't you? So thanks so much for reminding us that this is something that actually is faced by us. How do we walk the line between, we don't want to be a stumbling block, we don't want to turn people off, but we don't also want to be rigid and insisting on these practices? What is the middle way here? Well, there are no rules for these things. There's a certain amount of sensitivity and pastoral advice that we have to follow. So, first of all, I would suggest it depends upon what the situation is in terms of what you're trying to do. If you're talking about making the sign of the cross at the table or saying a blessing over your food, maybe nobody else even bothered to say a prayer before they eat. This happens sometimes. You quietly say a prayer and make the sign of the cross. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I don't think that's going to be a problem for your family, or that they would say you shouldn't be doing that. They might not like it, but I don't know that it's necessarily something that you should avoid doing. You should do, this is where the conscience comes in. If your conscience tells you, make the sign of the cross or say something or do something, you should really follow that. And if you're not sure, talk to your priest or spiritual father about that. Because very often what will happen is we'll have an impulse to do something spiritual. And then some other voice comes to our head and says, don't do that. Why are you doing that? What are you trying to show off? You're going to create a problem. And that might be the evil one trying to tell us not to do it. So this is a very tricky area. So it might depend on exactly what the situation is, where you are, and what you're trying to do. Sometimes we think that our actions might be turning somebody off. Like you mentioned, your father, who's turned off anything that seems even remotely Catholic, like the sign of the cross or something like this. But other times, I don't think we should assume what's in a person's heart or mind. Even if they react against it initially, or you can tell that they don't like it, I don't think that that's necessarily a reason not to do it. So when it comes to the sign of the cross, I would do that. Prayers before meals, I would do that no matter where I was. I don't care where I am. I always do on the plane before taking off, before landing. I always make the sign of the cross. And this is something, I think it's important. It's a witness. And not that you're trying to show off or show something, but that's a prayer. It is a natural thing for Orthodox Christians. And I think it's important for us to not assume that other people are going to be offended, even if you think they might be. There are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, sometimes by observing us, particularly if you are not combative about it, but you're simply engaging in a very reverent gesture, sometimes that opens communication. Sometimes that allows people to say, hey, Patrick, why are you always making the sign of the cross? And you say, well, it's just a prayer. We remember the crucifixion of Jesus. Don't you think that the crucifixion of Jesus is very important? Don't you believe that Jesus saved us on the cross? That's all I'm doing here. I'm making a statement that I'm honoring the Lord by remembering his cross. It could be something very simple like that. And then they say, oh, but how can you argue with that? Oh, that's Catholic. No, it's not. That's something that the early Christians did. We have lots of references to Christians signing themselves long before there was anything like a Catholic Church. So it allows people to about it. Sometimes even if they initially don't like it, they are intrigued, or they come to see the piety that is being expressed. And sometimes it has an impact on people because they are seeing us doing these things. So, and believe me, I've seen that. I've seen people who had an idea about who the Orthodox were, but never really experienced that. And then they go to an Orthodox church and they see people behaving. That's why it's so important that we behave reverently in church, because sometimes people who are not Orthodox come to church, and if they see people acting in an irreverent manner, that turns them off. And on the other hand, if they are behaving reverently, silently, bowing, crossing themselves, showing great reverence and piety, this has a real impact on people. So we're not doing it for that purpose. But if you wish to cross yourself or something is telling you to do this, then I think you should follow that initially. When it comes to something like prostrations, you should, because that's a matter of prayer, if there's a place where you can go to say your prayers quietly, that's something the Lord talks about. The Lord says we shouldn't trumpet our good deeds, right? We shouldn't let our right hand know what our left hand is doing, or vice versa. I can't remember if it's the right or the left. So there are things that we should do in private. But if the Holy Spirit moves you to do something, especially to make the sign of the cross, even if you're not praying over food or something like that, you just feel something and it moves you to, you should never stifle the Holy Spirit. If you're moved to make the sign of the cross or say glory to God or say something out loud, you should never stifle the Spirit. I don't think that that's right. And we do have to be careful that sometimes a message telling us not to do something can be coming from the evil one. That's a real possibility. So we have to consider, again, the Lord's instructions to go into a closet. Why does he say that? To pray? So that we don't do it to be seen by people. If you're not doing it to be seen by people, but you happen to be seen, that's a different matter. So the Lord addressed this too. We're not doing it to prove something. We shouldn't be doing it in a combative way. Well, I'm going to make my prostrations. I'm sure you're not thinking this, Patrick, but just in case somebody was, well, I'm going to do my prostrations just to prove to them that this is the right thing to do and this is who we are. Then that's not helpful. But if you go someplace quietly or you wake up before everybody else in the household and you say your prayers and somebody happens to see you doing a prostration, there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, and I wouldn't avoid doing it simply because somebody might see you doing that. So again, it's always about what is edifying and that we should not please others. We should not please ourselves, but please others. Now, by pleasing others, remember, he said, for their good, for their edification. It doesn't do anybody else any good for you not to do the cross, not to do your prostrations. You see what I'm trying to say? So let's remember the whole verse that St. Paul said, let us not seek to please ourselves, but others for their good. So if your action is not for the good of the other person, I'm not talking about avoiding arguments and things like that. That's something else. But if your action by being careful or about what you say or do is for the person's edification, you've come to this conclusion, especially with the aid of some advice from your priest, then, and also your own knowledge of your family, then that's something that you might consider. But I don't ever think that the sign of the cross is something that should ever be avoided, because it's almost like you're denying Christ and denying who you are. I don't think that's for the good and edification of the person, of anybody in your family, because what it would be saying to them is you don't really believe what you say you believe. That's how I would take it. At any rate, I have some fantastic words by St. Paisios on this very issue about disagreements and disputes among people and how we should consider the words of the Lord. So we're going to take a break right now. When we come back, we will hear from the one and only St. Paisios, not about vaccines, dear people, okay, but about things that are actually edifying to us. Okay, how do we handle difficult ecclesiastical issues? And we'll see whether or not he agrees with St. Paul. And you probably could guess. He does. I'll break.
Dr. Constantinou will be back in a moment. But the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
No end of books these days offer us techniques for self-improvement. But in the newest release from the Ancient Faith store, Gratitude in Life's Trenches, Robin Phillips takes a different tack. He shows us that God meets us where we are, in the pain and heartache of the present moment. Instead of looking for a way to escape from hardship, we can cultivate an attitude of gratitude, peace, and self-acceptance that will transform our experience of suffering. Drawing on his own experiences and his work as a consultant in the behavioral health industry, as well as stories of saints and sufferers, teachings of the fathers, and recent discoveries in neuroscience, Phillips shows us that the journey to personal well-being is one we can all travel, regardless of the hardships we may face. To find this book and others like it, you can go to store.ancientfaith.com. Again, that is store.ancientfaith.com.
We are back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
Okay, so this is from Saint Paisios's spiritual counsels. This is from volume 1, and we're on page 365, where he talks about confronting difficult ecclesiastical issues, or one of the nuns had asked him about this. So here again, look at the wisdom, at the pastoral sensitivity of the saint, where he says we have to avoid extremes. We've talked about this before. We have to avoid extremes. Here he says the following: we must avoid extremes. Extreme solutions will never solve a problem. In the old days, the grocer would add a little by little with a scoop on the scale till he got the exact weight and the scales were balanced. In other words, he did not add or remove large amounts abruptly. Extreme positions always cause suffering for our mother, the church, as well as for those who hold those positions of extreme positions. Because an extreme stance has a way of nailing people into place. It's like having a possessed person full of spiritual insolence and contempt for everything, pulling on one end, and a narrow-minded fool, zealous in his ignorance, pulling on the other. So he's describing a tug of war here. You've got a fool who's zealous but ignorant on one end, and then you have a person who's so extremely zealous he's like possessed on the other end. Don't you ever get the feeling like we're involved in this? This is exactly what we're talking about. People are arguing over these things, and it's like a tug of war. And what he's trying to say is neither extreme is right. And why are you having this tug of war to begin with? Continuing with Paisios. This is a confrontation, in other words, between a foolish zealot and a man steeped in spiritual arrogance. The two bicker and strike at each other, never agreeing, because what is missing from both is divine grace. And the worst that can happen, God forbid, is that there will be no end to their bickering. Each side will keep on striking the other back and forth without end. But those who can take on the two sides, bend them, and bring them together, help them to come to an agreement, will be crowned by Christ with two unfading crowns. What about that? Does that sound like Saint Mark of Ephesus here? Remember that St. Mark of Ephesus is not the model when we're talking about bickering over other issues in the church, anything that isn't dogma. Not everything we do in the church is of equal importance. We don't have to insist upon following every single little thing in the church, particularly when it's not a matter of dogma. So notice here how he's speaking about bending and not taking extremes and just going back and forth and back and forth, back and forth endlessly, trying to prove the other person wrong. There's no usefulness in this. Saint Paisios, we must be careful not to create problems in the church or to magnify the small indiscretions that take place here and there, because this only makes things worse and gives pleasure to the devil. The person who gets overly upset and angry at the sight of a minor mistake and rushes head on, supposedly to put things in order, resembles the foolish sacristan who sees a candle dripping during worship and rushes head on to put it out, knocking over people and candle stands in his way and causing an even greater disorder. Unfortunately, we have so many people keen on disturbing our mother church these days. The educated among them have grasped dogma with their minds only, rather than with the spirit of the Holy Fathers. He's talking about phronima. You see the difference? This is what St. Paul meant when he says, even if you know, you don't know. You can know something intellectually, but you don't have the mind of the fathers. You don't have the mind of the church, which means the mind of God. So who cares what you know intellectually? That's not important. Now, it's amazing to me as I read this that Paisios died in 1994. That was before the internet was a big thing. So we didn't, even though there were disagreements, obviously, among the Orthodox over things, it's much worse now. Much, much worse, because everybody's trying to prove how much they know. There's a lot of pride, a lot of ego. They're on these internet sites. They're talking about the end times. They're talking about the toll houses, talking about head coverings and, arguing back and forth for absolutely no purpose. It's not only not helpful, it's spiritually harmful, very harmful to the entire church. The entire church, yep. So let's go back to Paisios. Let's go back to the educated. So we see the contrast. The educated among them have grasped dogma with their minds only, rather than with the spirit of the Holy Fathers. The uneducated have grasped the dogmas with their teeth, which is why you hear a lot of grinding when they discuss ecclesiastical matters. As a result, they both cause greater harm to the church than the enemies of our Orthodox faith. It is good if a river's current is not strong, because strong currents sweep away logs, rocks, and even people. But a shallow, slow river is not good either. It's a breeding ground for mosquitoes. You see, when I'm talking about the middle way, this is what I mean. This is a perfect example of the right phronima. Look at his discernment. Look at his pastoral understanding. He's not taking a position about whether or not, he's not talking about a particular issue, whether or not, and it wouldn't matter to him whether or not somebody was right or wrong, but it's the attitude that's the problem. That's exactly what St. Paul is talking about in Romans 15. Then there are those who spend their time criticizing each other instead of working for the common good. Instead of keeping watch over themselves, they look for mistakes in others. They are on the lookout for what others say or write, just to strike mercilessly at them. However, these same merciless people claim that if they were to speak or write about the same exact topic, they, of course, would have used many great references from the scriptures and the fathers to support their work. Does that sound familiar? Those of you who are reading or listening to people who have this attitude should stop. The people who are constantly attacking others in the church do not have the mind of the church, no matter how many fathers, how many scriptures they quote. You should now be able to see. You should have your own spiritual discernment to see that people who are taking extremes on one end or the other end are not in the right. Even if they are, quote, technically right, even if they're intellectually correct on certain things, and they quote a mountain of fathers, who cares? What they're doing is harmful to the church. Can you see that? So stop talking about what this priest said or what that bishop said or what this monk said. It doesn't make any difference. This is the phronima of the Orthodox. This is what we're supposed to aspire to. This is the mind of Christ. This is a saint speaking, by the way, and he's saying the same thing that St. Paul was saying. And the people who are spouting their opinions, stirring up the church, getting people arguing on the internet, insisting upon their own way. They are not representing the mind of the church. You should recognize that now. I've talked about this quite a bit, but they are also not a saint, okay? We don't know if they'll become a saint, but because they're causing dissension in the church, disturbances in the church, I don't think so. This man is a saint. Look at how he is trying to instruct us on the middle way, not taking extremes, not arguing over things that are ultimately of no importance, not arguing simply for the sake of argument, not arguing because of ego, not arguing to prove that you are right, not thinking yourself that you're a modern day St. Mark of Ephesus and you're going to save the church, not striking merciless, not finding fault with others, but looking to themselves, striking mercilessly, he said. These people do great harm because on the one hand, they do injustice to their brothers and sisters, and on the other hand, they undermine them before the faithful. I'm thinking here of the so-called Orthodox priests who anonymously, supposedly, a big group of them, are writing against the bishops of the church because of the handling of COVID. They think they're wonderful. They think they're right. They think they're doing their duty, and they're so brave that they're anonymous. Okay, that's how brave they are. If they really believed what they were saying was true and that what the bishops were doing was really harmful, they would not be anonymous. Here he says that they're doing injustice and they're undermining the faithful. That's exactly right. And by the way, they're taking a position which is not theirs to take. They don't have that responsibility. They don't have the responsibility that the bishops have. The bishops are the ones who are, if you want to be Orthodox, follow everything in Orthodoxy, not just the things that suit you. The bishops have a role to play. It's not for the lay people to tell the bishops what to do. We can pray for them. But unless they're violating dogma, we don't try to instruct the bishops. Back to Paisios. These people cause great harm, the people who are trying to find fault with others and quote a mountain of fathers and scriptural quotations. These people cause great harm because on the one hand, they do injustice to their brothers and sisters by mercilessly striking them and finding fault with others. And on the other hand, they undermine them before the faithful. In fact, many times they sow unbelief in weak souls because they scandalize them. Those who justify their malice on their supposed rightful inspection of others instead of themselves, or by publishing ecclesiastical issues, even those matters too sensitive to discuss, on the pretext of, quote, tell it to the church, unquote, should begin first with their own little church, their own family, their own brotherhood. If that appears to be in good order, then go ahead and ridicule the mother, the church. Good children, I believe, never make accusations against their mother. And he's referring here to the church. So yeah, people are, by their behavior, scandalizing the weak. Scandalizing. People are turning away. And we're making ourselves a mockery among the non-Orthodox. The non-Orthodox see what we're doing and they say, look at those Orthodox. The Catholics, they say, oh, it's obvious that we're right to have a pope because look at how the Orthodox are behaving. They can't agree on things and they're arguing with each other over the internet. And sometimes their attitude of Orthodox people on the internet is so caustic, so judgmental, so biting, so hurtful. Shame on us. Continuing with St. Paisios, everyone is necessary in the church. Everyone offers his services to her, no matter what his character is, mild or strict. The body of the church is like the human body, just as we need both sweet and sour foods, even bitter herbs, because each food has something to contribute in vitamins and other nutrients. So too for the body of the church. Every one of us is indispensable. Why is he saying that? because we shouldn't be turning people away because they don't conform to what we think they should, either to in the way they're fasting or their head coverings or their beliefs about the end times or anything else. And by the way, somebody wrote to tell me that she was surprised that I mentioned about a Russian church where I was sort of scolded for kissing the icons on the iconostasi. She was coming from a Russian tradition. She said she never heard that you're not supposed to kiss the icons. I've heard it from Greeks too, by the way. You're not supposed to kiss the icons on the iconostasi. This is a very good example. I appreciate that. She thought maybe it was like a little, it was like a little sort of schismatic Russian church. No. It was the Russian Orthodox Cathedral and St. Nicholas in Washington, D.C. So no, it wasn't some little schismatic church. It's a fantastic church, by the way, if you ever get a chance to visit that church. So beautiful. But that really reminded me of something. You see how this person scolded me for going up to the icons and kissing them after the divine liturgy, and how inappropriate that was, seeing that he didn't know me and I was a stranger, especially. Even if I was a parishioner that they knew very well, it would have been better to say something to me kindly and gently. It's kind of a tradition in Orthodoxy, if this is what he believed, of which he obviously did, that we don't kiss the icons on the iconostasi, which is something I don't agree with. But he could have said it in a nice way. But what that reminded me of with the email that I received is the fact that there are so many things that we take to heart. Oh, this is a tradition. You're not supposed to do this, or you're supposed to do that. And this is what we learn, and this is what we embrace. And we think that everybody believes this. But the fact is that among the Orthodox, we do have different traditions. So it's not right for you to insist on your way, because that's the right way, of course, because that's what you do. We have to be open-minded to the fact that these things are little traditions, and they're not right or wrong. I would honor a person who says we don't reverence the icons, or I don't do that because, that's what I was. Fine, go ahead. There's no right or wrong in that. If somebody wants to come up and reverence the icon of the iconostasi, go ahead. More power to you. Either way, can you see this matches exactly what St. Paul was saying? Either way, you're honoring Christ. The person who eats, he eats unto the Lord. The person who does not eat, he does not eat unto the Lord. The person who kisses the icon does it unto the Lord. The person who doesn't does it unto the Lord. In each way, each person in his own way is showing respect. You see what I'm trying to say? You can't say that one is right and one is wrong. So that's why we have to be so careful before we judge others on their behavior, thinking that we know. To remind you, what did St. Paul say? And that's from 1 Corinthians. You think you know, but really you do not know. Why not? Because you're not acting as though you know, because you don't know God. If you knew the mind of God, if you had the mind of Christ, you wouldn't be criticizing somebody for something that is ultimately unimportant. Let's finish up with St. Paisios, and then I'll let you all go. Everybody in the church is indispensable, he says. Why? And of course, why are they indispensable? I gave you one reason, but they're indispensable because Christ died for them. And didn't St. Paul talk about that too? Your brother for whom Christ died? Really? You're going to attack this person for whom Christ shed his blood on the cross? There is no person who is not indispensable in the church. Everyone is indispensable. We can't say that this person doesn't matter, or how I treat them doesn't matter. And even people outside the church, of course. Everybody is indispensable. Continue with Paisios. Each person complements the character of the other, and all of us are obliged to tolerate not only the spiritual temperament of others, but also their human weaknesses. Now, unfortunately, there are those who have irrational expectations of other people. They expect everyone to have the same spiritual temperament as their own. And if others do not coincide with their personalities, if they are a little bit more lenient or more severe, they immediately conclude that they are not spiritual people. There you go. He's exactly right. Isn't that what's happening? Somebody's a little bit more lenient than you. Somebody's a little bit stricter than you. Oh, they're not spiritual. Oh my goodness. We have a long, long way to go, dear brothers and sisters. There's so much work to be done on ourselves. This is what the saint was talking about. This is what St. Paul was talking about. We have to be judging ourselves. Judge yourself so that you will not be judged. This is what the scriptures say. If we judge ourselves, we will not be judged. And remember what Paisios said. He realized that so often he was wrong, that he decided never to judge anyone, but to find excuses for others and to only be strict with himself. But we tend to do the opposite, don't we? We tend to examine others and find fault with them, and then we're lenient toward ourselves. We're strict in our judgment of others, and we're lenient. We always find excuses for ourselves. We're lenient toward ourselves when it should be exactly the opposite. We should be lenient toward others, and we should be strict when it comes to ourselves. So, well, we haven't quite finished chapter 15, but it's too late to begin the next section of 15. So I'm going to let you go a little bit early tonight, and we will continue next week. We're going to start talking about St. Paul's future plans. He's going to wrap up his lesson, his instructions to the Romans, and then he's going to tell us about his future plans. And what do you think? Did he go to Spain or not? We'll talk about that next time. But for now, I'm going to close with a prayer, and I wish you all a blessed week. Beautiful. Enjoy your forefeast or the after period of the Feast of the Dormition, or if you're just gearing up for it now, blessed Feast of the Dormition. Now let's close with our prayer. Lord, now let your servants depart in peace according to your word, for our eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to enlighten the Gentiles and the glory of your people, Israel. Amen. Good night.
The ancient faith for the modern world. This is Ancient Faith Radio.
Hi, this is Father Evan Armitage, priest at St. Spiridon Greek Orthodox Church in Loveland, Colorado, and the host of the Ancient Faith Radio Sunday night call-in show Orthodoxy Live.